let's talk a little bit about the whole max allowable offer thing. So this kind of goes back to what I was just talking about when it comes to like how you approach the seller and what they want versus, you know, what you want. It's gonna be hard for you to approach sellers and work the perspective of like, yeah, I can buy your properties cash, right? For let's just say the property's value is $100,000, right? And it needs $10,000 in work. That means as is value is $90,000 if it needs $10,000 in work, right? So that means as is $90,000. You got to be able to buy the property cash and then sell it. Well, if you're going to list it for, let's say, $90,000, let's say you didn't put any of that $10,000 of work into the deal. So you bought it, it's at 90, it's at 100,000 after repair value. It needs 10,000 in work. So it's 90,000, deduct 7% for listing, agent fees, and all that other kind of stuff. You know, that puts us at, let's see where it's at, 90,000 times 0.07. That's 6,300. So 90 minus, let's even round it to 7. That puts us at 83,000. So you could buy this for $83,000 and list it and break even. But nobody wants to break even, right? You want to wholesale this. And if a flipper is going to touch this, they're going to want to make on something so small cash wise, they're probably still going to want to make at least like 20 grand, you know, just because of the risk tolerance. It's not going to be like, oh, I'll only make 10 grand on a flip, right? So they're probably going to want to make at least, you know, 20 grand. So you deduct your 20 grand from that. It's typically about 20% cash value. So $80,000 invested at 20%, about 20,000 in profit that they want to make, right? So that's 63,000, right? That you would, if you were to buy it for 63,000, then yeah, if you wanted to flip it, you had the 63 grand to buy it, you could list it right away and, you know, make 20 grand easy. And in fact, you can list it as your agent and you can even make more than it. You probably make closer to 25 grand. But you want to wholesale, so you know, deduct another 10,000 from that. Now we're at 53,000, right? And so that's the typical, you know, what a lot of people would have done is they just would have went 100,000, 70%, or to deduct 30%. So they do a 70% max allowable offer. Then they deduct the expenses, and then they deduct a wholesale fee, and then they add like a 5% margin. By then you're down at like 15 grand or whatever they're going to make an offer on. So I don't typically do it exactly like that. But what I do look at it is I look at it from the perspective of understanding where the numbers are coming from. So $90,000 is what it's worth right now. It'll be worth, you know, $100,000. And I like to deduct that cost of the rehab and then figure out if it's listable, because ideally I don't do any of the rehab, right? Ideally I could just buy it and then just list it. That's the ideal situation. And so I start there and then I just remove, you know, that 7% that I know, you know, if I'm an agent, which, you know, I'm probably going to do 5%, not 7%, because I know that I can list for less than 6% market between both agents. And so, you know, 7% though, and then that puts me at X value. And then from that value, I'm like, okay, well, that's my break even point. I always figure out what my break even point is. If that's my break even point, then how much money do I want to make? Well, I know I want to make 30 grand. Okay, well then subtract 30 grand. If the seller's at, you know, in this case, it came out to 53,000. If the seller's at 55,000, right? Well, then that just means that I'm only going to make $80,000 wholesale fee or $28,000 flip.
Yeah.
Right. So it's one or the other. Like, how much am I willing to cut from my, you know, my number in order to get the listing or in order to get the deal? And so I don't really look at like the max allowable offer perspective is basically what I'm getting at. What I look at is I look at what is the deal and where can I fit in my piece of the pie. And I just have a really good understanding of what my buyers, if I am going to wholesale it, what my buyers are like willing to accept in returns. So I don't do the whole, and let me share my screen so we can have this on video for the calculator here. So what I don't do is I don't say, hey, the property is worth 100,000, so I'm just going to deduct 70% off. A lot of people don't understand why people do the 70% or the 30%. Why do you multiply it by 0.7 on a max allowable offer? Which your max allowable offer is typically purchase price, or ARV rather, minus 0.7, which is your 70%, minus rehab, minus wholesale fee.
Mm.
Right, that's typically where people are at, and then typically you subtract another like 5% for initial offer. So if I were to do that number here, 100,000 times 0.7, right, and this needed a $10,000 rehab, right, and then the wholesale fee of 10,000 minimum, we pretty much get really similar to that same number I had before, which was 53,000. Now we're at 50,000, right? And then another 5% off of that, so you multiply 5% off of that or whatever.
So that 5% is just to negotiate with, right? That's what.
Yeah, it's like your negotiation room, which you could literally just say, instead of really doing a 5%, I just be like, cool, I'll just start at 45,000 instead of 50,000. And that's a really easy way to look at it. But I prefer to educate and let people understand why this 30%. Where's that 30% difference coming from? Why are we doing multiplication by 70.7 there? And that's because the 30% is a culmination of 7% listing, right, and 23% flippers profit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if I were to say $100,000 times 0.23, we end up at 23 grand.
Yeah.
So if I were to wholesale this for 50,000, by the time we add in now 50,000 plus the 10,000 in rehab, that puts us at 60,000. Add in the 23,000 in flippers profit, plus the $10,000 wholesale fee, plus the $7,000 of listing fees and title fees, it gives us back to the 100,000 in purchase price, right? And so I just prefer to say, so that I'm understanding my full numbers, I just prefer to say, okay, it's $100,000, subtract my rehab of $10,000, that leaves 90. Now, what do I know if someone's going to invest, 90,000 in cash, which isn't the truth, by the way, and I'll show you why. If someone's going to invest $90,000 total in cash, though, I know, like, hey, they're probably going to want at least 20 grand back. Like, they're not going to take the risk unless it's a rental. Rental numbers might be a little bit different. But let's just subtract $20,000 just to kind of get to our base number here. That's 50,000 or 70,000, and then now subtract my wholesale fee, right, and my rehab, and you're back about basically at 50,000 again.
Yeah.
But here's the big thing: the flipper is not investing 90 grand. If the flipper is buying it from you for the $60,000, because you're under contract at 50,000 with the $10,000 wholesale fee, so they're buying it for 60, and then you add in their $10,000 in rehab, they're only buying it for 70 grand, not 90. So 20% of that is only 14 grand. So there's a buyer out there that wants a 20% return that's willing to probably only make, 14,000. In fact, I know a lot of buyers that are okay if they can turn and make a 10% profit, then they're fine with that. They'll invest 100,000 and they'll get 10% flat back, and they're okay with that. Because if you turn $100,000 10 times a year at 10%, you're making $100,000 a year.
Yeah.
Right.
Good.
So there's a lot of buyers that look at it from that perspective that are just sitting on cash, especially blue collar buyers in places like around Ocala with the mobile homes and things like that. Right. Basically what I'm getting at is understand really the numbers of how you get to the bottom line. And you can piece together and build a deal. Right.
Do you also look at carrying costs?
Yeah, and that was going to be my next point when it comes to these numbers. Where a lot of people mess up is they don't take into consideration on that $60,000 initial cost he's buying from you. There's about 2% in closing fees there from a cash sale perspective. So you got about $1,200 in closing fees there. So if you do that $1,200, but a lot of people like wholesalers, they don't add this in typically. The buyers know it, and this is where a lot of wholesalers lose their credibility. So it's about $1,200 there in that initial $60,000 in closing fees that the buyer is going to have to come to the table with. And then there's carrying costs. But this really depends on how they're coming to the table. If they're just a straight cash buyer and they're flipping this out of their own cash, then there is no carrying cost. There's just their standard ROI. So understanding what buyer you're using is big. And that's why people who have the cash in their own bank account are typically going to have buy it for a bit more than someone who doesn't. Because if let's just say the buyer is paying 10% APR on their money, they're going to have to reserve back like $5,000 in fees to make this deal happen, compared to the person who has $100K in their account to flip it. They don't have that, so they're going to pay you $5,000 potentially more than what the buyer that has to pay that $5,000 to the lender is going to pay you. But yeah, you got to account for that as well. But I do the same thing with that. I figure out an estimate. So I start from the 100,000. And for those that are listening on Spotify or whatever and can't keep all these numbers, you can always go back and look at the YouTube, playlist where I'm sharing my screen. But if I'm at 100,000 and I deduct that $10,000 in rehab, I'm going to guesstimate where the buyer, wants a cash return on, which is about 20,000 on that money. And like, the reason why that 0.7 is a really bad number also, by the way, is because like it doesn't scale. So if you have $1 million property, right, they're not going to make $300,000 in flip profit off $1 million property like every single time. Like that's the ideal situation, but it's not going to happen every time. They might be okay with making 150 grand on that. Yeah. So you really just got to understand where you're at from an asset class perspective, and that's why I prefer to break it down. Like, just understanding my buyers a little bit better, or understanding what I would pay. And all of my wholesale deals are evaluated based off what I would do. And a lot of people don't recommend that. A lot of people are like, oh, well, don't assume what a buyer is willing to pay. And the reason I don't go off that methodology is because if no buyer ends up wanting to pay it, then I'm still going to take care of the seller. I'm going to buy it to flip it myself. So I need to make sure that every offer that I make personally is always going to look good enough and be good enough for me to be able to close on a property. Because at the end of the day, it's my job to take care of the seller. It's my word that's on the line. And so I care about that more than I care about making money. So I'm going to make sure that, hey, this deal makes sense. If I'm going to invest 90 grand, I know that I'm at least going to want to make 20,000. So I'm going to subtract the 20,000. And then I'm going to subtract, everything else. I'm going to end up, let's say, at that 50,000 again. They're going to buy it from me for 60,000, like I said earlier. And then what I'm going to do is, I don't know what everybody's lenders are lending. I know an average of 8 to 10%, but for lower money, typically they're charging higher. So in this scenario, I'm going to do 12%. So I'm going to do 12%. Which is $7,200 on 60 grand divided by 12 months is $600 a month. Okay, so then what am I going to do? I know that's $600 a month in private money for $60,000 at 12%, 12% APR. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to say, okay, well, I'm going to look on the MLS and I'm going to try to find some recent listings. I'm going to figure out what average days on market is. Let's say that's 30 days. And then it's $10,000 rehab budget. So that's probably only going to take like maybe 3 weeks. It should take no longer than a month to rehab that. So I'm going to put it at like 90 days. I'm going to give it a little bit of buffer room and say it's going to take about 90 days. So I'm going to take the $600 times 90, or times 3 rather. It gives me $1,800 a month in money, or $1,800 total in money, right? If he's using like a private money lender, or something like that. Now, like private money, because it's in this scenario, we're dealing with lower cost. Like a hard money, very few hard money lenders deal with anything under 75,000 purchase price and stuff. So, this is going to be actual private money. So outside of the cost of, the deal itself, they're going to have $1,800 in money plus $1,200 in initial closing costs, which is another $3,000 total, right? So now that we have an idea of those numbers, if we were to redo the whole equation of $100,000 is the after repair value, multiply that by about 7%, is a $7,000. So I'm going to type this out on the left-hand side. So 100,000 ARV. Minus 7,000 in listing and post flip closing. Okay, so that puts us at 93,000. Subtract our $20,000 for our flipper's profit. Minus $20,000 flip profit. Okay. And then we're gonna, so now we're at 93,000 minus 20,000 puts us at 73,000. Okay, minus $10,000 rehab budget. Okay, and now we want to make at least $10,000 on our wholesale. So minus 10,000 wholesale. And then because we did our numbers properly and we set this up for the buyer really well, because what's going to happen if we don't do this is the buyer is going to come to the table and he's be like, well, I have closing costs on the front side and I have my private money costs, like you were saying. And so I can't buy it for that. And then you'd be like, well, no, here's my full breakdown, my numbers. Actually, you totally can, because I already did that equation at a 12% interest, at 10,000 rehab. So subtract the $3,000 there. And that puts us, at $50,000 initial asking or initial offer, or not initial offer. Technically, this would be your MAO, max allowable offer, at 10K. But really, technically, your max allowable offer could be 58,000 if you're willing to only make $2,000. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So we might start a little bit lower than that. So maybe we start at like 45,000. But I'm always going to gauge the seller first. I'm always going to figure out where they're at. So maybe initial 45,000 initial offer, and that's at basically 15K profit wholesale, right? And I actually have a calculator for like it breaking down all this stuff. If you just input the initial numbers in a community somewhere. So you have, so that's how I break down 100,000. Then you got the listing fees. Then you have the flipper's profit, whatever that may be, whatever you estimate. 23%, 30% cash on cash is typically cash investors, what they're typically looking to try to make. And so with that, if you assume 20,000 and they're okay with making 14,000, then you're just going to be able to sell it to them instead of 60,000. You might be able to sell it to them for 65, right? Yeah. So you can be reasonable on that budget. Your wholesale fee, and then your I didn't put it here, but minus 3,000 for money and initial closing. And so that gives us around 50,000. So that's how I break down numbers as far as my max level offers and everything else when I'm running through them. I also look at it from the perspective of, depending on the asset class, like what the rental rates are and those kind of things. Because let's just say, for example, this property is it only needs 10,000 in work, but it's totally rentable right now, and it would rent for $1,200 a month, right? Then my max allowable offer can be drastically different, because somebody's willing to spend at a 1%, return. They're willing to buy it for potentially $100,000 as it is, if it'll rent for $1,200, depending on the market. And so, I might make an offer upwards to $60,000 and sell it for $70,000, because they're going to get $30,000 in equity and they're going to rent it for $1,200 a month, right?
Yeah.
So you really just got to understand your buyers, and you really got to understand the both sides of the market, the flip side, the rental side. And now if I'm presenting this to the seller, I'm like, okay, seller, I would really love to work with you. The first things first is obviously my cash offer, is going to be a lot lower, because, I got to make sure I make my returns on my money, and maybe it won't make sense, but I can definitely still list the property if we're looking to get the most out of it. And I try to just gauge, and I personally try to let the seller know, they're going to be essentially kind of disappointed on my cash offer. Right. And if they're still game after that, that shows motivation. I'm always seeking out the motivation side of it. So, so after that point, I'm going to offer them well, here's my breakdown. I literally break down the numbers hey, this will probably be worth about 100,000. I'll probably list it for about that. No use in me hiding it. You're going to see it when I list it. Right. And so, I'm probably going to list it for about 100,000. I'm going to put about $10,000 into it in my cash, plus my initial cash coming to the table to close with you. And so I'll have right around 60,000 or so invested. And I actually say it like that because then they're like, oh, wait, he just said you'll have about 60,000 invested. I wonder, and he said $10,000 for rehab. That means he's probably only going to offer me 50. Right. And I just watch their face when I'm going to be making this offer, because they're running the numbers through their head. And so realistically, in order for me to be able to make, my returns on my cash, which is typically at least 20%, which is not which is pretty reasonable. I mean, the bank makes more than that off of the money you're storing with them. And so I would honestly be around $45,000 for a cash offer. Comparatively, if you have a little bit more time, we could probably list it and at least put an extra $20,000 in your pocket.
Yeah.
But if that doesn't work out, I can definitely pay cash for it. And obviously, in that scenario and those numbers, getting the wholesale or the flip, preferably the flip, is going to make you more money. Because you're going to make $30,000 on the flip. If you flip it yourself, $10,000 or $15,000 on a wholesale, versus if you were to list and sell that property, you'd only make like $3,000.
Yeah.